বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা
Welcome to the Hindu analysis for 16th June 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. AI1 not a variant of concern yet central. Now yesterday we discussed about how scientists are expanding their research and tracking the new variant or the new mutation of the Delta variant, that is AY1. Yesterday's reporting of particularly this mutation of the Delta variant, which is wreaking havoc in India, has caused a little bit of stir in terms of both scientific community and the society, because as you are well aware, though the second wave is damping down, people are worried about third wave and the implications of third wave on children, and particularly with this mutation, Delta variant already being a deadly variant, a new mutation which is more virulent, which is more transmissible, is causing a little bit of panic in terms of parents, because they feel that AY1 might affect children also. See, at this point of time, all of this information, all of these statements or all of these apprehensions are speculation. Nobody is saying that AY1 might particularly attack children or nothing like that. Most of it is misinformation and majority of it is abject fear, nothing more. So you shouldn't be worrying about it, and if anybody is really worried about such news or such items, you must try to quell their fears with basic facts. Now, in line with that, in order to allay all the fears of the public, the government clearly came out and said that the AY1 mutation of the Delta variant is not a concern as of yet now, because we are still tracking it, we are still studying the mutation itself, because this mutation is not only being seen in India, it has also been seen in other countries. Particularly in the case of India or around the world, 63 genomes of AY1 have been identified till June 7 according to GIS aid, particularly 14 from the US, 13 from Japan and 6 from India. So this mutation is not only geographically bounded to India alone, other countries are also seeing this mutation. Particularly UK has identified 35 genomes of AI1, and it has been named as Delta plus variant because it derived itself from the Delta variant, and it's kind of a software update for virus, which is very funny and sad at the same time. It seems that SARS-CoV-2 virus is going through iteration of an Apple product. They come with first variation in 6 months. After the 6 months, you have 6.5 or 6.2, and by the end of the year, you will have a third version of their operating system OS. So this virus is also acting as if it's a software company, and particularly Apple, because it is very secretive of how it is functioning and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, the new variant or the new mutation that we are seeing in Delta variant is now being named as Delta plus variant, and this mutation is called as K417N. Previously, a similar kind of mutation was identified with the Beta variant, and it is linked with high infectivity ratio. Now, how far this variant has been prevalent or prevalence in India is not known yet, because we are at the cusp. We are still in initial phases of testing and tracking this mutation of Delta variant. We have to know how this is going to impact our fight against COVID-19 pandemic, and we have to also be in awareness of the fact that what is AY1 going to play, or the role AY1 is going to play in the third wave or the supposed third wave that India will experience in the very near future. So that is the Delta plus variant. AY1 has been now named as Delta plus variant, and the mutation itself is called K417N. But let us be clear, nothing is sure about this, so don't speculate, just be aware of how the development is going on. Moving on to the next article, America's mistake in the forever war. This is particularly in regards to how US had made particularly major blunders in their invasion of Afghanistan, and after invasion or the toppling of Taliban itself in the initial phases of war on terror in Afghanistan or war on Taliban, what were the subsequent mistakes made by US that led to the current stalemate that we are seeing in Afghanistan? Afghanistan is currently in a place where it is neither here nor there. Neither the Taliban controls majority of it, neither the Afghan government controls the majority of it. Most of it is operating in the form of a grey area or a grey zone. So let us understand what this particular author has to say about how US made blunders, what are those, and what is the current scenario in ground on Afghanistan now. Now, one thing that you have to establish before going into anything related to Afghanistan is the peace process or the peace talks that the American government initiated with the Taliban are at a stalemate, because both Taliban have refused to negotiate with Afghan government, stating that they do not recognize Afghan government, and whatever the talks with Taliban that were supposed to start in Doha last year have been stalled for months together. In between, Qatar also offered some sort of a respite to. In between, Taliban asked the talks be shifted to Qatar, but again there are certain sensitivities surrounding it, so it didn't move forward. Now, as of today, or at least May 1st, according to this article, Taliban have seized 8 districts in 4 regions, and they have control of at least 6 provincial capitals, including Kabul, Lashkargah, Kandahar, and they control the entry and exit points of these capitals, provincial capitals. Now, particularly the Lashkargah is very unique in sense that that was the place where the strongest of the Taliban were holed up. Hemland was also one of the, I think in earlier classes we discussed about how Americans fought their way to Hemland twice, only to be lost in the hands of Afghan security forces. So these areas are strongholds of Taliban. Americans tried, or the coalition forces tried many times, successfully captured these, retook their Taliban capitals, but nonetheless they are back in the control of Taliban for whatever reasons. Now, statistically speaking, about 22% of Afghanistan's 398 districts are in direct control of Taliban, and 24% are in the control of government, while more than half of the country's territories are contested. So, contested in the sense that both claim that they control the territory, but when you go to the ground, you see that the fighting is still going on. Now, what are the 3 fundamental mistakes that US made in Afghanistan according to the author of this article? So there is a cliched title given to Afghanistan called The Graveyard of Empires. The British lost, the British troops and the Indian troops in 43 or 42 were massacred. Again, Soviet Union tried to prop up a communist leadership there. They overthrew the leader. They installed some communist puppet there, and again with the blessings of CIA, Stinger missiles, and funding of US security agencies, the USSR was also, or the Soviet Union was also defeated in Afghanistan. So one would assume that America would learn all the mistakes that were made by both the British and the Soviets, and would try to course correct itself when it started talking about invading Afghanistan to overthrow Taliban, which was supporting Al-Qaeda. That was the whole premise of invasion of Afghanistan. So the first issue was that the US went into Afghanistan without learning anything from the country's history, or was blindsided by its own unipolar hubris. It had so much self-confidence that it dug its own grave in Afghanistan. And the matter of fact, when you look at the historical aspect of Afghanistan itself, see, in Afghanistan, it is not that one group of Taliban is fighting against the government. They don't recognize the government itself. They are fighting for their territory. It's like warring tribes. Afghanistan is nothing but a group of warring tribes that function dysfunctionally and successfully. What I mean by that is there is no one group as such that wants to overthrow the government or have the control of entire territory under its power. At this point of time, Taliban is a group of splinter leaders working towards a centralized leadership, that too a dysfunctional one, but strung together by Pakistan security agencies. So there is no one center of power that you take out that power and Taliban is finished. So Taliban is kind of a ragtag group of mercenaries working for their own interests. For them, it's not the idea of Afghanistan. For them, it's the idea of the territory that they control. So if I'm wrong here, but that's the premise of it at least. So instead of going for toppling of Taliban and sowing the seeds of democracy, that was the theme of Bush administration. If you look at the entire Bush administration in the American White House history, that they talked about sowing the seeds of democracy in regions where they had no business to be in with first place. So it didn't study the history properly. It didn't go with the right context or the right idea, and it didn't have an exit plan in place before going in. So they just went in, they thought that we'll make some exit plan and we'll come out. But what happened was, what they should have done at least is that they should have gone after the Al-Qaeda terrorists. They should have targeted surgically against these terrorist operatives of Al-Qaeda. They should have destroyed their networks, and they should have toppled the entire structure that Al-Qaeda built upon Taliban, so that Al-Qaeda wouldn't survive in anywhere in the world, and then simply should have withdrawn. Instead, what they did, they said that we are going to topple Taliban. Yeah, Al-Qaeda was the prime target, but along with it, we are also going to topple the Taliban itself and rebuild a centralized democratic state in Afghanistan. That is the word that is a problem and origin of issues with Afghanistan is centralized democratic state. Democratic is the right word. Democratic can be done. Democracy can and will survive in Afghanistan. But the concept of centralized democratic state in Afghanistan does not exist, because it is a group of tribes that operate within the boundaries of Afghanistan. So it's a very decentralized society. It is not a centralized society. Because when you go into the regions or the far fringes of Afghanistan, you will find war tribe leaders, not politically elected leaders. Tribal leaders control majority of territory in Afghanistan. So that is the issue here. They should have gone for a decentralized democratic state in Afghanistan. Instead, with the Bush administration and the neoconservative ideologies of globalism, they tried to topple the Taliban and tried to rebuild a centralized democratic state in Afghanistan, which will not work because that is not in the fabric of Afghanistan. Right? If you go into the history of it, at any point of time, there was a strong central leadership in Afghanistan, either it may be the king or a ruler or whoever it may be. From my understanding, you can always clearly see that there was a strong central leadership, but below him were these all tribal leaders who were functioning within their own purview. So when it came time to defend the boundaries of Afghanistan, the centralized king would give a call and these tribes would send their soldiers, and they would have defended the boundaries of Afghanistan, and that was done. They would have returned to their own territories and everything was well and good. So neither these people were trying to control the tribal leaders or the regional leaders, nor these regional leaders were trying to control the central authority of Afghanistan. So there was a dysfunctional at the same time a functional hierarchy in place. So that sentiment should have been continued, or at least tried to give a structured shape to that decentralized methodology or decentralized governing of Afghanistan by the US forces. Now, when September 11 looms very close to next month or so, US is practically giving up. They have surrendered to the Taliban, meaning they are moving out without a peace plan in place, without a security plan in place for Afghanistan, how they are going to support Afghanistan and so Afghan forces and so. And they are just returning out of Afghanistan or pulling out of Afghanistan with just a assurance from Taliban stating that they are not going to help any more terrorists from their territory, either Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, which has to be seen again. It is not a binding word. It's not like you are negotiating with a state actor. At the end of the day, the Taliban is a non-state actor with brackets inserted by Americans, identifying them as a state actor. So a lot of gray area is at play here. So that was the issue. When at the initial phases of invasion, when America started invading at the release of 2000 or 2001, they were able to defeat the Taliban. At the end of the day, Taliban was toppled and Al-Qaeda was forced to hide in the caves of Afghanistan. Now in December, when things were going pretty well and America was in a very advantageous position, Taliban offered a surrender deal to Americans, stating that Maulana Ammar, who was the leader of Taliban should be allowed to return home, and along with other modest terms which were acceptable even by those standards, far more acceptable now considering how bad things are in Afghanistan. If a strategic person or a nation building state such as America is thinking like this, they should have simply gone for the surrender deal and should have agreed to the terms then and there, because they were at an advantageous position. Instead, they thought that we are going to defeat Taliban from their own country. Yeah, toppling them from power was easy, but defeating them in their own country, in their own backyard, has become a problem. Along with that same line, US also launched the invasion of Iraq to again topple Saddam Hussein in the same concept of exporting democracy from the shores of America. Now, according to the author, this was the second mistake. In order to concentrate more on Iraq and toppling Saddam Hussein, America took Pakistan's tactical support, because Iran would never give their ports to America to supply their troops in Afghanistan. So they were left with only one country that would allow supplies to travel through them to Afghanistan, that is Pakistan. Now Pakistan's services to US were so critical that US was willing to overlook certain facts that Pakistan was doing in Afghanistan, particularly how tied up Pakistan is with the Taliban itself. Now Pakistan played a double game. On one side, they were supporting the US campaign. At the same time, they were offering refuge to Taliban supporters and Taliban leaders on the territory of Pakistan. So when US declared victory in Afghanistan, it was very, very premature. And even before they had an established structure in place in Afghanistan, they went ahead and invaded Iraq in 2003. Now when US was distracted with Iraq and the Saddam Hussein issue and everything, this gave a lot of movement and free space for Pakistan to play their own trump card there. When America was very busy with 2000 Iraq invasion, Pakistan pumped so many resources into Taliban that Taliban were able to regroup, and in this time they grew stronger. And at the same time, you have to look at the parallel of Afghan government. It was struggling with corruption, and there were so much infighting that nobody knew who was at power at that point of time. So that was a particularly vulnerable time where America was distracted, Pakistan was let loose, allowed Taliban to regroup with the assistance of Pakistan. The Afghan government was still weak in its baby stages because they were fighting with one another, and there was a lot of corruption at that point of time. Now, after 10 or 15 years of waging a continuous war in Afghanistan where American and allies lost so many lives and so much money was pumped into rebuilding that nation. At this point of time, people in America became very sour towards the idea of continuing war in Afghanistan. When you look at the timeline of the concept of withdrawal from Afghanistan, it started with Obama administration. Later on, Trump was the first one to vocally say that it's time to end this thing and bring back our troops. For whatever reason, Trump that couldn't happen during the Trump era as such. But at the end of the tail end of Trump era, Trump was pretty particular about bringing his troops back. But when Trump lost, it got passed on to Mr. Biden. And Biden has clearly said that whatever the Pentagon says, whatever the Army or Defense Secretary says, we are going to pull back troops at any cost on September 11th. And at the same time, with the rise of China, US is also shifting a lot of its assets and focus to East Asia. They have started rebuilding relations. They have started repairing relations with the Southeast Asian partners, and the continuation of supporting troops in Afghanistan is no longer a viable option for America at this point of time right now. Now, when you talk about troop withdrawal, it should have been done in an orderly way, but right now it's a knee-jerk reaction. It looks like a knee-jerk reaction, because you're pulling out your troops in a short span of time, well ahead of timetable that was set, without an agreement in place, without negotiations happening, and now it's a complete surrender and the Taliban has effectively won. One of the most notable quotes of the Afghan war was, "The Americans had all the watches and the Taliban had all the time." When Americans invaded and they were at American invasion was at its height of peak of its height, when Taliban was biding its time, they simply said that America doesn't have all the time in the world. We can wait 20-30 years, and when America finally gets tired, we can take over immediately without little resistance. That is what is happening here. But one roadblock here right now is, it is not as easy as one thinks that Taliban will gain overall control of Afghanistan. Yes, America is pulling out. So what is the situation here? The situation right now here in Afghanistan particularly is, Taliban controls regional territories. Afghan government controls most populous capitals, provincial capitals. The Afghan security forces are battle hardened at this point of time. They are close to 2 crore, right? And they are pretty much taking the entire job of the American soldiers, right? Without American support, these Afghan security forces are able to hold back Taliban in certain regions. Not effectively, but nonetheless they are holding the lines. And you have to remember that the special forces of Afghan government are trained by US special forces. So they are an effective fighting force. They have been conducting absolute raids on Taliban positions, right? They have been pretty effective. Whenever they needed to take out a leader or a head person of a group, Afghan security forces have been conducting operations day in, day out to take out or eliminate top leaders of Taliban, or at least top leaders of terror organizations. So the situation right now is of a stalemate. The Taliban cannot take over provincial capitals because these were being successfully thwarted by Afghan security forces. The Afghan security forces cannot take control of Taliban held area because they are also getting a lot of resistance from Taliban. And the advantage of US air support to Afghanistan is invaluable and indispensable at this point of time now. So again, recently we have been hearing how US is thinking about setting up airbase in that area so that they can support Afghan operations. But nonetheless, Though the American exit right now is not in favor of the Afghans themselves, it is sure to shift balance in the side or in the direction of Taliban. But there are a lot of things at play, but currently the situation is a stalemate and we don't know how bad things are going to get for common citizens of Afghan. Moving on to the next article, an acquittal with no good but the bad and the ugly. This is particularly in the case to the recent judgment of a trial court acquitting Tarun Tejpal, who was an editor of a popular magazine, who was charged in 2013 for having sexually assaulted an employee of his who was working for him during an event. Now, one of the acquittal of him, or the judgment of his acquittal in this case, was a cause of huge uproar in India, where even the government said that this judgment doesn't hold water, and they refiled their case in front of the Bombay High Court. So let us understand what were the problems with the judgment that were given and what is the issue here. Now, the Solicitor General of India, Tushar Mehta, during the hearing said that the lower court's judgment lacked sensitivity regarding crimes against women and the awareness of the sections of criminal laws, and the laws have evolved and the entire judgment proceeds as if it is the victim on the trial. That was the absolute case in the case of that particular judgment, because the judge was acting as if the victim of the assault was the criminal there. Not the person who committed the assault, but the receiver or the victim of the assault was the criminal in that case, which was unacceptable because you don't do that. Now, what are the problems here and how the law has, or the landscape of the law has changed in addressing sexual assault cases in India? Now, in 2002, based on recommendations of the 172nd report of the Law Commission of India, two major changes were made in the Evidences Act. The first was, the Act was amended to prohibit the defense counsel from asking questions to the prosecutrix in a rape case about her general character to impeach her credibility. You cannot ask questions that put the credibility of the victim under the spotlight. And the second was, the defense was not permitted to put questions to a witness in the cross-examination about the general immoral character of the prosecutrix and the adduced evidence. Now, the simple amendment, what are the two amendments talk about? The law does not permit the character assassination of the victim anymore. What used to happen earlier were, if the defense deemed it so that the victim is of a loose character, they would try everything in their power to establish that fact, to water down the case itself and try to get the case dismissed altogether. With that amendment in 2002, this procedure or this method of watering down the character of the victim cannot be done so, because character assassination is no longer allowed under the law. If anybody does this, they are going to jail or they are going to get contempt proceedings initiated against them and they are going to be fined. You cannot question the character of the victim, particularly in the case of sexual assault or sexual molestation. This was the amendment in 2002. Now, what you have to understand is, whenever a sexual assault case happens or a trial proceeds, you cannot assume that all sexual assault cases or survivors of sexual assault cases will conform to a single formula. Each individual behaves differently under different circumstances. Each victim is a different person. Each victim's assault happens in a different environment. So the idea that every sexual assault victim will behave in the same way, every sexual assault case will take place in the same way, investigation will take in the same way or the same process doesn't apply, is not possible, because each case is in its own and it is individual. Everything has to be tailored to that particular case or that particular victim. And the third that you can identify here is that every omission does not amount to contradiction. So what used to happen was that when the survivors used to give statements in front of a judiciary official or during an investigation procedure or in the FIR or the first information report, so if there were any discrepancies in the versions between the statements made before the police, the court, or any other scenario, let us say the victim gave an interview to a newspaper or some other news channel, and the versions during that interview were a little bit contradictory to what she or he made in a police statement and what he or she made in a court statement. Earlier, what they used to do was they used to use that discrepancies against the victim themselves. In most cases, it's a she. But now that cannot be done so. Now, it has been very well established that it's a try-it law that the previous statements of the prosecutrix and the witness cannot be used to shake their credibility. Again, it boils down to discrediting their credibility, because that is how you win these cases. For whoever came up with the idea, I think they should serve some jail time. Now, coming back to the question itself, again the Indian Penal Code was amended in the year 1983, and the question of identity of the victim of the rape has come into public domain again. Now that amendment clearly stated that if anybody publishes the identity of the survivor of the rape, they can be punishable under the newly added section of 228A. You cannot publish their name, you cannot publish any matter or any information that may lead to the survivor of rape being identified. Now that has been prohibited. News channels tend to play loose and goose with that. Sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't do. In the particular case of a South Indian actress who was molested, the news channels in South India were the first to reveal the identity of the survivor of rape. Now, the question also comes to, if you are talking about the identity, any information that may lead to the survivor being identified shouldn't be published. It is prohibited. It includes the survivor's husband name, their email address, etc. Any small or little information that could lead to her being identified. But in the case of that acquittal, her email address and the name of the husband was published. The second issue with that acquittal judgment was that there was certain inadequacies by the investigation officer. The investigation officer did some mistakes which led to the entire evidence or the entire investigation being rejected. Now, as far as the investigation is concerned, it must be always true and it must be unbiased, honest, just, and always in accordance with the law. So, when you talk about investigation of a sexual assault or a sexual molestation, it should be a fair investigation, and the entire premise of the investigation should be that truth be brought out and the case be made or case be presented in front of the court, because the end result or the end goal of the investigation is to bring justice to the victim. It can be said that there were some lapses, there was some ignorance on the part of the investigation officer in that particular Tarun Tejpal case in regards to electronic evidence. But such lapses on the side of the investigation officer shouldn't lead to the entire rejection of the case and throwing the prosecution's case out of the window. Now it is time for us to reorient ourselves in terms of how sensitive oriented and sensitively driven these cases are, and how we should be operating under the law so that the sensitivities and the morality stands and victims are delivered justice. So moving on to the next article, embracing cryptocurrency. So on 9th of June, El Salvador became the first country to adopt a Bitcoin as a legal tender. Even lawmakers of El Salvador went to as far as that if anybody wants to make money on cryptocurrency, they are welcome to El Salvador and they can gain citizenship of El Salvador for 3 bitcoins or something like that, which is crazy. So, but that is not new. El Salvador is not the country, not the first country, nor going to be the last country. Many other countries, many small countries particularly, are going to embrace cryptocurrencies like nobody's business. Now, it also shows that the cryptocurrency is gaining mainstream momentum, meaning until and unless it was a grey market, it was a black market, it was used for drugs, it was used for terror organizations, whatnot. But small countries, particularly like El Salvador is not a small country, but you cannot say that it's a big country either. But El Salvador does brings the spotlight back on the legality of the cryptocurrency, whole ecosystem altogether. Now, every country is trying to tailor their own approach to cryptocurrencies. Nobody is going to go as far as El Salvador, but they are going to do something that will match their legal systems, match their fiat currency systems, match their economic systems. But they are at the end of the day, they are going to legalize cryptocurrencies and try to tailor it to their own ecosystem with certain safeguards. Now let us come back to India. For whatever reasons, India adopted a very vague stance on cryptocurrencies. For whatever reason, I don't know. At the initial stages, there were certain issues with cryptocurrencies, but right now there are a lot of issues that have been addressed. But for whatever reasons, India had this vague stand in cryptocurrencies. It has been largely laissez-faire regulatory pace since cryptocurrency transaction was recorded in 2010. Between 2013 and 2018, the government response has been cautionary. They were alerting to the pitfalls of or the potential risk of cryptocurrencies posed, and that is valid because there were a lot of unanswered questions during that period also. But in 2018, RBI decided that we are going to ban cryptocurrency trading, which was subsequently overturned by the Supreme Court in 2020. But RBI stance has been very clear. The court reasoned that there were alternative regulatory measures short of an outright ban which the RBI could have achieved and try to come out with a regulatory policy that reduces the risk associated with cryptocurrency trading, all while accepting cryptocurrency trading. So one of the good news in terms of cryptocurrencies was the government of India decided that they are in the process of, or at least they are in talks of considering cryptocurrency or identifying cryptocurrency as a asset class, which is a good thing because it means that they identify cryptocurrency exists at this point of time legally in the sense. Though the Supreme Court thing was overdone, in the earlier articles we talked about how a shadow ban still exists on cryptocurrencies where certain banks like HDFC, Axis and other banks do not allow transactions of cryptocurrency with the trading accounts related to cryptocurrency trading, so on and so forth. So there is still an effective shadow ban on cryptocurrencies in India. So one of the rays of hope in terms of cryptocurrency or pro-cryptocurrency groups in India is that there is currently a draft called Draft Cryptocurrency and Regulation of Official Digital Currency Bill 2021. Now the crux of the bill talks about it wants to criminalize all private cryptocurrencies while laying the regulatory work or regulatory framework for an RBI backed digital currency, like how the Chinese are doing. Chinese have their crypto yuan. We also want to come out with a crypto rupee. Now this is where, from a technological standpoint of view and a currency standpoint of view, the duality comes into play. So you want to ban cryptocurrencies, but you want to promote your own at the same time. So India has to make up its mind as to how it is going to regulate. See, still this is a draft proposal. There is a lot of time before the bill is tabled in front of the parliament to come out with a comprehensive and a cohesive mechanism and a plan to allow the rise of a RBI backed digital currency, all while encouraging other cryptocurrencies in the country. So the approach should be that an equitable strategy that reduces the risks of other cryptocurrencies while increasing the safety and the value of our own digital currency. So let us see how the draft finally gets reworked or rejigged as one assumes it to be, and how it looks like there is a lot of positive voices on cryptocurrency within the government itself. But at the end of the day, RBI has the final say and the finance ministry has the final say in this. And majority of these people in power right now do not tend to warm up to the idea of cryptocurrencies. So it is still a laissez-faire, but a regulatory framework is in the works right now in terms of cryptocurrency regulation in India. Moving on to the next article, FCI rice to be used for ethanol production. So few days back, Prime Minister Narendra Modi presented a roadmap for advancing the target date for achieving 20% blend of ethanol in petrol by 5 years to 2025. To a greater extent, we have been successful in increasing the blending levels of ethanol in petroleum products by 5%, which is on trend or on path to jump to 8.5% by the end of this year, which is a welcome news. In a process to boost that, the central government has allocated 78,000 tons of rice procured for food security purposes to be diverted to ethanol production. So this is going to be done at a subsidized rate of 20 rupees a kg. The thing that you have to notice here, the primary feedstock for ethanol production would be, or particularly grain-based ethanol production would be coming from maize, but allocating rice will boost that process because it diversifies the grain so that companies can choose and opt from which they produce the ethanol from. Now, this is part of the plan of the government to double the distilling capacities by 2025. Again, in lieu of Prime Minister target to achieve the deadline 5 years prior to what was set last year. Now, this is in lieu with the government's idea of focusing ethanol production on a molasses based production. So we have to see how this is going to help, and if we have to also observe how the government will increase FCI's diversion of FCI procurement, particularly grain procurement or rice procurement to ethanol production, because remember, a lot of food grains that are stored for food security purposes get wasted because of lack of proper storage, loss to mice, loss to other problems, mold and other issues. If Government of India is able to successfully divert right capacities, not all of it, but right capacities of food grains for ethanol production, this would effectively kill two birds at one stone, meaning it would reduce the wastage of rice that is being stored unnecessarily in godowns, and it would increase ethanol production at a cheaper price, incentivizing more production and faster adoption of ethanol. So again, we don't want to waste food grains, we don't want to risk food security. At the same time, we have to incentivize ethanol production and ethanol adoption. So it's a very good plan from the Government of India. Moving on to the next article, Taiwan reports largest incursion by Chinese forces. From time to time, Chinese Air Force and Chinese Navy incur into the respective zones of Taiwan. Right now, recently, China has been very aggressive in the way of incursions into defense identification zones of Taiwan. Generally, the number of incursions in a day are one at least, but they tend to be a single or a double aircraft. But recently, as many as 28 Chinese Air Force aircraft, including fighters and nuclear capable bombers, entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and this is the highest or the largest reported incursion to the date. As far as the response from Beijing, they have been silent. They haven't commented on anything. But This is a change in pace for the Chinese incursions into Taiwan's airspace. Now, this is a problem because Taiwan has been complaining about Chinese intentions or Chinese Air Force actions in the air defense zones of Taiwan. So, this is going to be an issue if and when China intends to increase their onslaught on Taiwan. As far as the Americans are concerned, there has been no word as to how America is going to support if and when. It's not a time of if, it's a time of when Chinese Communist Party tries to take over Taiwan, and we don't know whether the allies will come to the aid of Taiwan. So again, in a bit of news that is worrying for the entire region itself, because if China takes over Taiwan and America and other allies don't say a word or try to push back, that is going to set the tone for the next coming decade in terms of Chinese supremacy in the region and in the world. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা।